Hello YouTube. This is something of a supplement to my series on modal logic, although it should be accessible to anyone really. The modal scope fallacy. You'll come across this quite a lot. It's one of the more popular fallacies in academic philosophy, and it's surprisingly easy to commit it, so I thought I'd have a look at it. I assume you're familiar with scope fallacies in general. If not, here's a classic example. Consider the argument, all that glitters is not gold. This rock glitters, therefore this rock is not gold. Now, obviously something has gone wrong in this argument. What has gone wrong? Well, the trouble is that there are two interpretations, at least two interpretations, of the first premise, and the argument trades on this ambiguity. We may interpret it as attributing a property to all glittering things. So, in other words, all that glitters is non-gold. This interpretation is probably the most straightforward, but it's wrong. The statement should be interpreted as denying that all glittering things have a certain property, so not all that glitters is gold. So in other words, there are some things that glitter that are not gold, but some things that glitter could still be gold. I mean, obviously, this is, simple stuff. Anyway, the point is, interpreting the first premise as B, as it should be interpreted, we can see that the argument is invalid. Now, in A, we say that the negation operator has narrow scope. It attaches only to the predicate is gold. So, like this, all that glitters is not gold. In B, the negation has wide scope because it modifies the whole sentence. So, not all that glitters is gold. The whole sentence falls within the scope of the negation. So when we're evaluating arguments like this, we have to bear in mind which parts of the sentence are modified by the negation, and sometimes the sort of superficial grammatical appearance is misleading. Okay, well, the modal scope fallacy is part of the family of scope fallacies. One way to illustrate it is with a simple argument for necessitarianism. This is the belief that there is no possibility, that nothing is contingent. Everything that's true is necessarily true, everything that's false is necessarily false. The world could not be any way other than it is. That's a very strong and rather surprising thesis. The argument for it is very simple. Suppose Suppose P is an apparently contingent statement. For example, Obama won the 2008 president election. Then, here's the argument. If P is true, then it cannot be false. If P cannot be false, then it is necessarily true. If P is true, then it is necessarily true. Okay, well, the first premise seems to be a straightforward statement of the law of non-contradiction. Unless you're a dialetheist, it's pretty much uncontestable. The second premise is just a statement of definition. Again, it's pretty much incontestable. And the conclusion obviously follows. It's obviously valid. So let's formalise this argument. We'll use a bit of modal logic here. Here's a key for those who aren't familiar with formal logic. So the argument would be formalised like this. If P is true, then it cannot be false. It doesn't matter which we choose here, because necessarily not and not possibly are absolutely equivalent. I mean, just think about it. There's no difference between necessarily not and not possibly. So the consequence here can be translated either way. Second premise: if P cannot be false, then P is necessarily true. Again, we could translate the antecedent here as necessarily not if we wanted to. And the conclusion: if P is true, then P is necessarily true. There we go. Right. Now, there's the argument formalised. Now, the mistake occurs in the first premise, in premise 1. There are two important interpretations of the first premise, and the success of the argument depends on confusing them. So, ask yourself, what exactly are we trying to assert when we say this, when we utter P1? What are we trying to assert? Well, under normal circumstances, this is just a statement of the law of non-contradiction, as I mentioned above. A proposition cannot be both true and false. So if a proposition is true, it cannot be false. Right? That's fine. But the trouble is that English can be very misleading. The straightforward translation of P1 into logic is, as we've seen, if P, then not possibly not P. But in this case, we shouldn't give a straightforward translation. If P, then not possibly not P, or if P, then necessarily not P, is not the law of non-contradiction. Rather, P1 should be translated not possibly P and not P, or necessarily not P and not P. So to express P1 more properly in English, we should say it is not possible that P is both true and false, or P cannot be both true and false. You see, the point is that when I say if P is true, then it cannot be false, I'm referring to the mutual incompatibility of P's truth and falsity. The falsity of not P is necessary relative to P's truth. It's necessary given P's truth. But P's truth is not necessarily given. P's truth is a contingent matter. So since the truth of P is contingent, the falsity of not P is also contingent. So let's put it another way. To say that not P is necessarily false relative to P's truth, it can also be expressed like this, and this allows us to see where the scope ambiguity lies. Necessarily, if P, then not P. And this should not be confused with if P, then necessarily not P. Okay? You see, in 1, we say that the modal operator, necessarily, has wide scope because the operator ranges over the entire conditional. That is, that the conditional falls within the scope of the modal operator. In 2, we say the operator has narrow scope because it attaches only to the consequent of the conditional. Now clearly, these are very different statements. Okay, if we have the modal operator ranging over the entire conditional, that's very different from attaching the modal operator only to the consequent of the conditional. So these are very different statements, but equally clearly, English is poorly equipped to express the distinction, and they become ambiguous in the statement, if P is true, then it cannot be false. Once we have better logical machinery, it's clear that the correct interpretation is 1 here. It's 1. And it's clear that the necessity attaches to the entire conditional. So the falsity of not P is necessary on the condition of P's truth. And that's all. So, okay. If the cannot in premise 1 is interpreted as having wide scope, the statement is probably true. But then the argument for necessitarianism is clearly invalid. It becomes this, and this argument is obviously invalid. Again, both of these are equivalent. To say not possibly P and not P, or necessarily if P then not P. Those are both logically equivalent. I won't explain that, but they are. And anyway, the argument is invalid. On the other hand, if the cannot is interpreted as having narrow scope, the argument is valid, but the premise is apparently false. In fact, it clearly begs the question. To say that if P, then it is not possible that not P, or if P, then necessarily not P, that assumes what is to be shown, namely that P's truth implies its necessity. So not possibly not P and necessarily not P are equivalent, they're logically equivalent to necessarily P. So you would only accept P1 interpreted narrow scope if you already accept necessitarianism. Those who don't accept necessitarianism have no reason to accept P1 with the narrow scope. Okay? So that's the modal scope fallacy concerning a lethic modality, necessity, possibility, contingency. I hope that was reasonably clear. Let's consider a different kind of modality, Deontic modality. The modality of obligations, permissions, oughts and ought nots, and so on. Here's a basic key for Deontic logic. Okay, now let's think about some basic Deontic principles. If P is obligatory, and P entails Q, then Q is obligatory. It seems reasonable to assume that Q is obligatory also. So if we can derive Q from P, then we know we can derive it is obligatory that Q from it is obligatory that P. This symbol here, this turnstile symbol, just means Q is logically derivable from P, or it is obligatory that Q is logically derivable from P. And this does in fact hold in standard Deontic logic. In fact, we can make a weaker statement here. Let's say if P is obligatory and P entails Q, then surely we must say that it is not obligatory that not Q. Or in other words, it is not the case that it is forbidden that Q is not forbidden. Or more simply, Q is permissible. So if P is obligatory and P entails Q, surely we must say that Q is permissible. So if we can derive Q from P, we know we can derive it is permissible that Q from it is obligatory that P. Let's call this principle O1. Now this surely must hold. If some act is obligatory, then anything that is logically entailed by that act must be permissible on pain of contradiction. If P entails Q, we can't say that P is obligatory but that Q is forbidden. That would be very unfair. Now the problem is that this leads to a variety of rather troubling paradoxes. Suppose we come across Frank, one of the nicest people in the village, being brutally attacked by a gang. We also see some police nearby. Well, many of us would say that the police ought to intervene in the assault. They ought to stop it. It is obligatory that the police intervene in the assault on Frank. Here's the problem. It's clear that the police intervene in the assault on Frank entails Frank is being assaulted. The police can hardly intervene in the assault if the assault isn't actually happening. But then it seems, by the principle O1, that it is obligatory that the police intervene in the assault on Frank entails it is permissible that Frank is being assaulted. But that's a very strange result indeed. The basic problem can be resolved by paying attention to scope. The trouble is that there are really two different ideas involved in the statement, the police intervene in the assault on Frank. This statement expresses, first, that Frank is being assaulted, and second, that the police intervene in the assault. So let's translate this into simple logic using this key. A is Frank is being assaulted and I is the police intervene in the assault. With this in mind, let's restate our paradox. So here's our principle O1. If P is obligatory and P entails Q, then Q is permissible. And here's the descriptive statements. Frank is being assaulted and the police intervene in the assault entails Frank is being assaulted. So A and I entails A. That's absolutely fair. It is obligatory that Frank is being assaulted and the police intervene in the assault entails it is permissible that Frank is being assaulted. So O bracket I and A entails PA, right? It's permissible that A. Well, I'm sure you can see the problem here already. The trouble is with the scope of the negation, the scope of the obligation operator here. We have given the operator wide scope. The conjunction falls within the scope of the operator. But this is wrong. When we translate it is obligatory that the police intervene in the assault on Frank, we should give the obligation operator narrow scope. So Frank is being assaulted and it is obligatory that the police intervene in the assault, or A and OI, A and it is obligatory that I. From this, we cannot derive that it is permissible that Frank is being assaulted. Again, English is misleading. In English, the operator looks like it has wide scope because it comes at the start of the statement. So we say it is obligatory that the police intervene in the assault on Frank. We have the obligation operator at the start of that statement. But that's not how we should translate it. Note that in this statement, we don't have a conjunction here. There's no, grammatically speaking, there is no conjunction. But we can see that there are, in fact, two ideas involved. This statement is a conjunction of two ideas. So the the grammatical form can be misleading. So when we translate, it is obligatory that the police intervene in the assault on Frank, we must not confuse sort of these two interpretations here. So long as we keep scope in mind, the paradox disappears, because it is permissible that Frank is being assaulted cannot be derived from this conjunction. Basically, this is valid, right? That's valid, and so by the principle 01, this is also valid. But the premise is false, okay? It's false that it is obligatory that Frank is being assaulted and that the police intervene in the assault. Here, the premise is true. It's true, Frank is being assaulted and it is obligatory that the police intervene in the assault, but this is obviously not an instance of 01, since the obligation operator only attaches to one conjunct. It doesn't range over the whole conjunction. Okay, a final example. Here is a simple argument for infallibilism, the claim that certainty is a necessary condition for knowledge. So this claim, this is a claim that if you're able to doubt a belief, if you have any doubt at all for a belief, then it's not knowledge. So quite a strong claim. If you know that P, you cannot be mistaken that P. This seems fair enough. After all, truth is a condition of knowledge. So if you know something, it must be true, which surely means you can't be mistaken about it, right? If you cannot be mistaken that P, you are certain that P. Again, this just seems like a fairly reasonable definition of certainty. Therefore, if you know that P, then you are certain that P. And we can formalise the argument this way, and here is a key. I'm sure you can see the problem by now. The ambiguity occurs in the first premise. We have given the necessity operator narrow scope, but it should be given wide scope. The translation should be necessarily, if X knows that P, then X is not mistaken that P. So to state the first premise more properly in English, we should say necessarily if X knows that P, and X is not mistaken that P, or it is not possible both that X know P and that X be mistaken that P, whatever. As with the argument concerning necessitarianism, what we're trying to express in this first premise is the mutual incompatibility of knowing that P and being mistaken that P. Well, we've seen a few cases of the modal scope fallacy here. Obviously, it's somewhat more difficult to spot, most of the time than it is in the arguments I've given here. But anyway, I hope this was hopeful, and I hope you keep a lookout for this sort of thing when you're reading philosophy. Well, that's it. Goodbye.